In 332 BC, the Mediterranean watched a standoff that should have ended in failure. Alexander of Macedon was only in his early 20s, but his reputation was already bigger than any crown. He had smashed Persian armies in open battle and raced down the coast of the Levant, taking city after city. Most ports surrendered quickly because in war, coastal cities have one nightmare above all: being cut off from the sea. But Tyre was different. Tyre wasn't just a city. It was a fortress built on an island, sitting roughly half a mile offshore, protected by open water, heavy walls, and a powerful fleet. For generations, it had lived off maritime trade, wealthy, proud, and convinced geography itself was its greatest weapon. From Tyre's towers, the defenders could see Alexander's army spread along the mainland coast. They could also see what he did not have. He didn't have a real navy. And without ships, an island cannot be properly besieged. You cannot surround it. You cannot block its harbors. You cannot roll up your siege engines to its walls. You can shout threats from the shore, but the sea will swallow your rage and keep the city safe. That's what Tyre believed. Why Tyre mattered. Alexander didn't come to Tyre just for pride. He needed the coast. A conqueror marching toward Egypt and deeper into Persian territory could not afford hostile naval bases behind him. Tyre's fleet and harbors represented a strategic problem. As long as Tyre resisted, Persian-aligned ships could threaten supply lines and communications. Coastal security mattered, not only for food and reinforcements, but for the message it sent. And Tyre's message was simple: you may win on land, but you do not command the sea. Tyre's defenses were famous. Ancient writers describe walls rising sheer from the water on the seaward side. The numbers vary across sources, and later retellings often exaggerate them, but the core truth remains. Tyre looked like a city designed to make a conqueror give up. The Tyrians weren't just confident, they had history on their side. Powerful empires had pressured Tyre before. Some had taken a mainland settlement, Old Tyre, but the island city remained a real prize, and it had endured. So when Alexander's envoys arrived with a request, permission to enter the island city to sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, whom Greeks associated with Heracles, Tyre treated it like a negotiation between equals. The Tyrian leadership offered a compromise. Alexander could sacrifice on the mainland at Old Tyre, but not inside the island city. To a ruler like Alexander, that was not a compromise. It was a refusal. And according to the ancient tradition of the story, the situation escalated fast. Accounts differ on the exact details, but the outcome is consistent. The diplomacy broke down, and Alexander decided Tyre would fall, even if the sea had to be dragged out of the way. The impossible decision. Imagine being one of Alexander's generals that day. You stand on the mainland coast and look at the target, an island fortress, protected by waves and walls, supplied by ships. Your king turns from the water and says, essentially, we're going to build a road to it. Not a bridge, not a fleet overnight, a causeway, a massive stone and timber mole, pushed out into the sea until it touches the island walls. It wasn't simply bold. It was a plan that demanded engineering on a scale most armies never attempted, under constant attack, and against a city that controlled the surrounding water. But Alexander had two advantages that were easy to underestimate. First, he had a workforce. An army is not only fighters, it is tens of thousands of hands. Second, he had material. Old Tyre stood on the mainland, and Alexander ordered it dismantled for stone and rubble. In war, nothing stays sacred for long if it can become useful. So the work began, building land across water. At first, the mole moved quickly. The water near the coast was shallower, and the Macedonians could dump rock, broken masonry, and earth to build out a firm base. Teams worked in rotation. Some hauled stones. Others set timber supports. Others guarded. From the island walls, Tyrian defenders watched the line creep outward. At the beginning, there was mockery. There is always mockery when someone tries something that looks impossible. Tyrian ships sailed close enough to shout insults. Archers and slingers took shots at exposed workers. But the laughter didn't last because the mole didn't stop. Every day, the line grew longer, and the closer it got, the more Tyre's greatest advantage, its control of the sea, became an urgent weapon, not a comfort. The Tyrians began attacking in earnest. Fast ships rushed the construction zone, firing arrows and hurling projectiles. The Macedonians responded by placing archers and artillery on the growing mole, turning the construction site into a forward fighting position. Then nature joined the battle. As the mole reached deeper water, waves and currents began to tear at it. Storms could undo days of labor overnight. Loose fill washed away. Timber supports shifted. The sea did what the Tyrians hoped their navy would do. It tried to erase Alexander's work. So Alexander adapted. He ordered the mole widened and strengthened. More stone, more mass, less vulnerability. It was slower, but it held. The project became less like building a road and more like forcing a coastline to change shape. Tyre's counterattack. Fire on the water. Tyre still needed a decisive way to break the siege, something more final than arrows. So the defenders used one of the most feared tricks in naval warfare: fire. Ancient accounts describe a fire ship attack designed specifically to smash the Macedonian siege works at the mole's leading edge. A vessel or vessels, packed with flammable material, was sent drifting toward the structure, timed with wind and current. When it hit, the flames spread into wooden towers, scaffolding, and defenses. For the Macedonians, it was a nightmare. Fire doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care how many days you worked. It eats. The mole suffered severe damage, and the Tyrians tried to follow up, raiding by sea, striking equipment, killing exposed crews, then pulling back behind protection of their harbors. If Alexander had been an ordinary commander, that moment might have ended the siege. It is one thing to build outward. It is another to watch your work burn and still believe you can win. But Alexander didn't treat it as a message to stop. He treated it as proof that the plan was hurting Tyre. So he rebuilt, again, stronger, wider, and better defended. The turning point: Alexander gets a fleet. Tyre had been safe because Alexander lacked ships. That was the defender's central calculation. Then the calculation changed. As Alexander advanced, many Phoenician cities and island kingdoms shifted allegiance, and ships that once sailed under Persian influence became available to him. Ancient sources describe fleets arriving from places like Cyprus and from Phoenician ports that had already submitted. Suddenly, Tyre wasn't facing an army yelling from the shore. It was facing an army that was learning to become a coastal power. With ships in hand, Alexander could do what a real siege required: blockade the harbors, prevent resupply, pressure the city from multiple directions, and support the mole with naval protection. Now Tyre's wall was no longer a clean boundary. It was a front line, the defender's most feared weapon, heated sand and grit. Here's where the siege becomes infamous, not only for engineering, but for defensive brutality. Many ancient and later accounts of siege warfare describe defenders using heated substances dropped from walls, boiling liquids, hot pitch, heated metal, and sometimes hot sand or gritty material. The reason sand is terrifying is simple. Sand gets everywhere. Where oil can run off and water can cool, hot grit slips into armor joints, under collars, inside sleeves. You can't easily grab it and throw it away. If you try to strip armor off and panic, you expose yourself to arrows. If you keep it on, you keep the heat against your skin. Even if the details are debated or embellished in later retellings, the concept is brutally realistic. A defender's goal is not only to wound, but to break the attacker's will to climb. And that is exactly what Tyre needed, because by this stage, the mole had brought attackers close enough to contest the walls directly. The defenders fought with every advantage they had: height, cover, prepared positions, and the ability to rain force downward onto crowded targets. The Macedonians, despite their discipline, faced a kind of fear that doesn't show up in heroic speeches: the fear of being trapped inside your own protection. How Alexander broke the wall anyway. Alexander didn't rely on one method. He layered pressure until something cracked. He brought siege engines forward, battering rams and artillery, to pound the walls. He used ships to attack weak points from the seaward side. He kept the blockade tight enough to strain supplies and morale. Most importantly, he looked for the moment when Tyre's defenses were stretched too thin, when the city had to defend multiple directions at once. Ancient sources emphasize coordination. naval assaults to distract defenders, artillery bombardment to suppress the walls, and assaults timed to exploit breaches. When the final breakthrough came, it came with violence and chaos, the way city assaults usually do. Fighting erupted on the walls and at entry points. Defenders tried to hold choke points. Attackers tried to widen openings. Both sides understood the truth. Once a disciplined force gets a foothold inside, the outcome becomes a matter of time. Tyre had defied the logic of siege warfare for centuries. But it could not defy a siege that changed the landscape, brought in fleets, and refused to end. The island fortress fell. The aftermath, why the punishment was so severe. This is a part of the story that people remember with discomfort, because it reveals something about Alexander that doesn't fit the clean myth. After Tyre fell, ancient sources describe severe punishment. Large-scale killing during the sack, mass enslavement, and the crucifixion of a significant number of captives along the shore. The exact numbers vary by account, and later retellings often harden them into a single dramatic figure. But the scale of retaliation was real. Why was Alexander, who could, at times, be politically shrewd and even merciful, so harsh here? Several reasons are likely, and they can overlap. Tyre made the siege personal. A long siege creates anger. Casualties accumulate. Every failed assault burns into memory. If Tyrian defenders killed envoys or humiliated the Macedonians during the siege, as some sources suggest, Alexander's desire to punish would have sharpened. Tyre had strategic value, as an example. Alexander was building momentum. Cities were constantly calculating whether resistance was worth it. A brutal consequence sends a message faster than diplomacy. Do not make me spend months outside your walls. The siege cost was enormous. Even a victory can feel like an insult if it takes too long. A commander may punish not only the defeated city, but the idea of defiance itself. None of this excuses what happened. It explains a logic that often drives conquest, the mix of strategy, pride, and vengeance. Tyre paid in blood and in chains. The strangest legacy, the sea never fully returned. There's a final twist that makes the siege of Tyre more than a story of war. Alexander's mole did not vanish after battle. Over time, currents and sediment built up around it. Sand collected. The underwater landscape changed. What had been an island gradually became connected to the mainland, transformed into a peninsula. In other words, Alexander didn't just defeat a city. His siege altered geography. Today, the area around Tyre still carries that ancient scar. The coastline is not exactly what it was before the siege. A decision made for war shaped the land for centuries.